The Galactic Hegemony had ruled the stars for 10,000 years before they found Earth. And in all that time, they had never met a species quite like humanity. Commander Erel Thax stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the blue planet grow larger on his viewing screen. And he felt nothing but contempt for the primitive creatures who lived there. The humans had only just discovered space travel, and their technology was laughable compared to the great civilizations of the galaxy. And yet the Hegemony Council had decided that these backwards creatures might be useful. After all, the Vectory Horde had invaded Hegemony space 6 months ago, and they were winning. And the council was desperate for soldiers to throw at the enemy. Rilthax had received his orders that morning, and they were simple enough. Collect 50,000 human soldiers and transport them to the war zone on Kashari Prime, and give them whatever equipment the Hegemony no longer wanted. He understood what that meant, and he approved of the decision. Because why waste good weapons on creatures who would be dead within a week? The recruitment had been easy enough, because the humans were told they would become citizens of the Hegemony if they served. And thousands of them had volunteered without understanding what they were really signing up for. Now, they filled the cargo holds of his transport ships, and Relthax did not bother to learn their names or faces, because dead soldiers did not need names. Sergeant Major Elena Vance stood in cargo hold 7 and looked at the equipment that had been dumped in front of her soldiers, and she felt her jaw tighten with anger. The pulse rifles were at least 30 years old by Hegemony standards, and half of them had warning lights flashing on their power cells. And the instruction manuals were written in a language none of the humans could read. The armor was worse, because it had been decommissioned after failing safety tests. And some of the chest plates still had burn marks from whatever battles they had seen before. The vehicles were held together with emergency welds and prayers. And Elena counted at least 12 different models that had been thrown together without any thought to compatibility. Private Chen picked up one of the rifles and tried to activate it, and it made a sad whining sound before shutting down completely. And he looked at Elena with confusion in his eyes. Sergeant Major, this stuff is garbage, he said quietly, so the alien guards would not hear. Elena nodded slowly and looked around at her soldiers, and she saw the same realization spreading across their faces as they understood what the terrorist Hegemony really thought of them. They were not allies or partners or valued additions to the war effort, and they were meat to be thrown at the enemy. And the Hegemony did not expect any of them to survive. Lieutenant Marcus Cole walked over to Elena and stood beside her, and his face was calm, but his eyes were burning with that cold fire she had seen in soldiers who had been pushed too far. They think we are going to die, Marcus said softly. They do, Elena agreed. They do not know us very well, do they? Elena allowed herself a small smile, and she looked at the pile of broken equipment, and she began to see it differently than she had a moment before. She did not see garbage anymore, and instead she saw raw materials, and she saw possibilities, and she saw the building blocks of something the Hegemony had never imagined. Get me Torres and Yamamoto and Okonkwo, she told Marcus, and her voice was steady now. Get me everyone who knows how to build things, and everyone who knows how to fix things, and everyone who knows how to make something out of nothing. Marcus smiled grimly and went to gather the engineers and mechanics and tinkerers who had enlisted alongside the combat troops. Elena picked up one of the broken pulse rifles and turned it over in her hands, and she thought about all the wars humanity had fought throughout its history. They had fought with rocks and sticks when they had nothing else, and they had built weapons from farm tools and kitchen knives, and they had turned defeat into victory more times than any species in the galaxy could imagine. The Hegemony thought they were sending humans to die, but they did not understand what humans were capable of when they were backed into a corner. Private Torres arrived first, and she was a mechanic from Mexico City who had spent her life fixing cars that should have been scrapped years ago. And she took one look at the equipment and started laughing. "This is what they give us?" Torres asked, and there was no fear in her voice, only excitement. "This is perfect." "Perfect?" Another soldier asked in disbelief. Torres picked up two of the broken rifles and held them together. And her eyes were already seeing how the parts could be combined and modified and improved. "Where I come from, we do not throw things away just because they are broken," she said. "We fix them, and we make them better. And sometimes we make them into something completely new." Yamamoto arrived next, and he was an engineer from Osaka who had designed systems that the corporation said were impossible. And he immediately began sorting through the vehicle parts with growing enthusiasm. "The hegemony builds everything to exact specifications," he said as he worked. "They follow rules and protocols, and they never deviate from the approved designs. And that is their weakness." "How is that a weakness?" Someone asked. Yamamoto held up two incompatible parts and smiled. "Because they cannot imagine doing what I am about to do." Elena watched her people gather around the equipment, and she saw despair transform into determination, and she saw fear become fury. And she saw soldiers become something far more dangerous. The transport ships carried them through the void of space toward Kashari Prime. And Arelthax never bothered to check on his human cargo, because he assumed they were huddled in the dark, waiting to die. He did not know that the cargo holds had become workshops. And he did not know that the humans were working through every sleep cycle to rebuild their equipment. And he did not know that they were preparing for a war that would change the galaxy forever. Elena stood among her soldiers and watched them work. And she made a promise to herself that she would bring as many of them home as possible. The hegemony had sent them to war with scrap, and they expected nothing in return except bodies to count. They were about to learn that humanity did not die easily, and they were about to learn that the most dangerous creature in the galaxy was a human with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The war on Kashari Prime would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Kashari Prime was a world of red dust and broken rock, and the sky burned orange from the fires of war that had raged across its surface for months. The Vectory had already killed 3 full battalions of hegemony soldiers on this planet, and those soldiers had been equipped with the finest weapons and armor the galaxy could produce. And still they had fallen. Commander Arelthax watched from orbit as the human transports descended toward the planet's surface, and he expected to receive reports of their destruction within 6 hours. At most, the humans landed in a valley surrounded by jagged cliffs, and they had barely finished unloading their broken equipment when the first Vectory scouts appeared on the ridge above them. The Vectory were terrifying creatures with 4 arms and thick natural armor, and their weapons fired beams of concentrated plasma that could melt through steel. And they had never lost a war in their entire history. As a species, Elena saw them coming, and she knew her soldiers were not ready, and she knew their weapons barely functioned, and she knew they should all be dead within minutes. "Everyone into the caves," she shouted. And her soldiers grabbed what they could carry and ran for the network of tunnels that had been carved into the cliff face by some ancient civilization. The Vectory followed them into the darkness. And the first battle of Kashari Prime began with humans fighting in conditions that should have guaranteed their defeat. But something strange happened in those caves, and the Vectory did not understand it. And neither did the hegemony observers who watched through their sensors. The humans did not break and run, and they did not surrender, and they did not die as quickly as everyone expected. Private Torres had spent the entire journey to Kashari Prime modifying pulse rifles, and she had figured out how to bypass the safety limiters that the hegemony had installed. And now those rifles fired with 3 times their normal power. The weapons overheated quickly, and some of them exploded in the hands of the soldiers who fired them. But they also punched through Vectory armor in ways that standard rifles could not. Yamamoto had rewired the targeting systems of their broken vehicles, and he had connected them to a network of sensors that the soldiers carried on their bodies. And now the vehicles could provide covering fire even without drivers. The Vectory pushed into the caves expecting easy kills. And instead they found humans who fought like cornered animals. And they found weapons that did not behave the way weapons were supposed to behave. 6 hours passed and the humans were still alive. And Arelthax received this news with confusion and irritation. 6 days passed and the humans had pushed the Vectory back to the ridge. And Arelthax received this news with something close to shock. Elena established what she called the Forge in the deepest part of the cave network. And it became the birthplace of a new kind of warfare. Human engineers worked around the clock to tear apart their failing equipment and rebuild it into something new. And they did not follow any rules or protocols. And they did not care that what they were doing was supposed to be impossible. A mechanic from Detroit figured out how to use Vectory blood as fuel for their vehicles, because the alien blood contained chemicals that burned hotter than standard fuel cells. And soon the humans were harvesting their enemies to power their machines. A chemist from Mumbai discovered that Vectory chitin could be melted and reformed into armor plating that was stronger than anything the hegemony had given them. And soon human soldiers were wearing the bodies of their enemies as protection. A programmer from Seoul hacked into the Vectory communication network and learned their language in 3 days. And soon the humans knew exactly where their enemies would attack before they attacked. Private First Class Daisuke Tanaka was just a mechanic who had fixed trucks back on Earth. And he had no formal education in advanced engineering. And he had never built anything more complicated than a motorcycle engine. But Tanaka looked at 3 destroyed hover vehicles, and he saw something that no hegemony engineer would ever see. And he spent 4 days welding them together into a single machine that should not have been able to move. He called it the Frankentank. And it was ugly and asymmetrical, and it made terrible grinding noises when it moved. And every principle of hegemony engineering said it was impossible for such a machine to function. The Frankentank rolled out of the caves on the 7th day of the battle, and it tore through a Vectory assault force like a monster from human. Nightmares Arelthax watched the footage, and he did not understand what he was seeing, because the machine on his screen did not match any known design, and his computers could not even classify what kind of vehicle it was supposed to be. What is that thing? He asked his officers. None of them could answer him. Lena led her soldiers out of the caves and across the valley, and they pushed the Vectory back kilometer by kilometer. And they did it with weapons that did not exist and vehicles that should not work and armor made from the bodies of their enemies. Forge grew larger as more humans arrived from other sectors, and they brought their own skills and their own ideas. And they added to the growing library of improvised weapons and techniques. A welder from Brazil created a new kind of grenade by combining communication equipment with explosive chemicals, and the electromagnetic pulse it generated could shut down Vectory weapons for 30 seconds at a time. A hunter from Kenya designed a sniper rifle that used Vectory bone as ammunition, because the bone was harder than any metal the humans had access to, and it could punch through armor at distances that should have been impossible. A teenager from the Philippines built surveillance drones out of kitchen appliances and navigation sensors, and she controlled them with a modified gaming controller that she had brought from Earth. The hegemony had given the humans garbage because they expected the humans to die. And instead, the humans had turned that garbage into weapons that the galaxy had never seen. Elena stood in the center of the forge and watched her people work. And she felt pride swelling in her chest, because this was what humanity did when the universe tried to destroy them. They did not give up, and they did not accept defeat. And they took whatever they were given, and they made it into something better. The Vectory commanders sent reports back to their homeworld, warning that something had changed on Kashari Prime. And they said that the new enemies were different from anything they had faced before. The hegemony commanders read those same reports, and they began to feel something they had not felt in centuries. And it was not fear of the Vectory, but fear of the humans they had tried to sacrifice. Commander Irelthax looked at the battlefield data, and he realized that his disposable soldiers were not dying as planned. And he realized that they were winning, and he realized that he had made a terrible mistake. The humans had been sent to war with scrap, and they had forged that scrap into something terrifying. They were not victims anymore, and they were not expendable pawns. And they were becoming something that the galaxy had never seen before. They were becoming conquerors. 6 months had passed since the first humans landed on Kashari Prime, and the war had changed in ways that no one had predicted. The Vectory Horde had expected to crush the human forces within days, and instead they found themselves fighting an enemy that grew stronger with every battle. And they could not understand how this was possible. Supreme Commander Vraxkol of the Vectory stood in his war room and stared at the holographic map of the battlefield. And he watched the red markers that represented his forces retreat again and again. His advisors stood around him in silence because none of them had any explanation for what was happening. And none of them wanted to be the first to admit that they were losing to a species that had been fighting with primitive weapons just a generation ago. "Explain this to me," Vraxkol demanded, and his voice was cold with barely controlled fury. "Supreme Commander, the humans do not fight like any enemy we have faced before," one advisor said carefully. "Their tactics change constantly, and they never repeat the same strategy twice. And we cannot predict what they will do next. Then study their patterns and find their weaknesses." Vraxkol snapped. "That is the problem, Supreme Commander. There are no patterns." Captain Amara Okonkwo crept through the red dust of Kashari Prime with her strike team close behind her, and she carried a weapon that had no name because it had never existed before. 3 weeks ago, it had been a standard communication array, and then the engineers in the forge had torn it apart and rebuilt it with components from 6 different devices. And now it was something that could shut down Vectory power armor with a single pulsar. Team carried weapons that were equally strange and equally deadly, and none of them matched any design that existed in any database anywhere in the galaxy. Private Hassan had a rifle that fired bolts of superheated metal, using a power source that had been scavenged from a crashed Vectory fighter. And he had painted the barrel with symbols from his homeland because he believed it. Brought him luck. Corporal Silva carried grenades that she had built herself from medical equipment and cleaning chemicals. And each one was slightly different because she kept finding ways to improve the design specialist. Wong had a blade attached to his arm that was made from Vectory chitin and sharpened to an edge that could cut through steel. And he had learned to fight with it in a style that combined 3 different martial arts from Earth. They moved through the darkness toward a Vectory supply depot. And they did not have a detailed plan because detailed plans were for armies that fought the same way every time. Humans had learned that predictability was death. And they had learned that the only way to defeat an enemy with superior numbers and technology was to be completely and utterly unpredictable. Amara signaled her team to stop, and she studied the depot through her modified scope. And she counted the guards and noted the patrol patterns. Then she threw away everything she had observed and did something completely different from what any reasonable commander would do. She walked straight toward the front gate. The Vectory guards saw her coming, and they raised their weapons. And they expected her to dive for cover or retreat or do anything that a rational soldier would do in that situation. Instead, she smiled and waved at them. And while they hesitated in confusion, her team attacked from 3 different directions at once. Hassan fired his rifle at the power generators, and the depot went dark. And Silva threw her grenades at the guard towers, and they exploded with chemicals that burned through armor. And Wong came out of the shadows with his blade and cut through 3 guards before they even knew he was. Theramara joined the fight with her pulse weapon, and she shut down every piece of vectory technology within 50 meters. And the aliens found themselves blind and helpless in the darkness. The battle lasted 4 minutes, and when it was over, the humans had captured enough supplies to keep the forge running for another. Mumthraxol received the report of the depot attack, and he threw his datapad across the room in frustration. They walked up to the front gate. He said in disbelief, "Who does that?" "Humans, apparently," his advisor replied quietly. The Vectory were an ancient species who had conquered dozens of worlds, and they had developed their military tactics over thousands of years. And those tactics were precise and efficient and had never failed them before, but those tactics depended on enemies who behaved in predictable ways. And the humans refused to behave in predictable ways. And the Vectory did not know how to adapt. Elena had established what she called the doctrine of chaos, and it spread through every human unit on Kashari Prime. The doctrine was simple. Never do what the enemy expects. Never fight the same way twice. And never let the enemy understand what you are going to do. Next, human commanders shared ideas through coded transmissions that they called the scrapyard network, and a technique that worked in one sector would be modified and improved and used in a completely different way in another sector. A sniper technique developed by the European forces became an ambush strategy for the South American forces, and a vehicle modification designed by the African forces became a defensive fortification for the Asian forces. The humans were learning from each other and evolving faster than any military force in galactic history. And every day they found new ways to turn their disadvantages into advantages. They, Vectory, captured a human soldier during a skirmish, and they interrogated him for hours trying to understand how the humans were winning. "Your weapons are inferior," the interrogator said. "Your armor is inadequate, and your numbers are smaller than ours. So how are you defeating us?" The soldier laughed despite the pain he was in, and he looked at his captor with pity in his eyes. "You want to know our secret?" he said. "Our secret is that we do not have a secret, and we do not have a plan, and we do not have a strategy that you can study and counter. That is impossible. Every army has a strategy. Not us," the soldier said. "We just do whatever seems like a good idea at the time, and then we do something different. And you cannot predict chaos, because chaos is what we are." The interrogator reported this conversation to Vrak Skull, and the Supreme Commander understood for the first time what he was truly facing. The humans were not fighting a war in the traditional sense, and they were fighting a kind of anti-war. And they were using their own unpredictability as a weapon. He had spent his entire life learning the rules of warfare, and now he faced an enemy that did not follow any rules at all. Elena received word that human forces had won 17 engagements across Kashari Prime in the past week, and each victory had been achieved through tactics that had never been used. Before she stood in the forge and watched her engineers building weapons that should not exist. And she knew that the war was turning in their favor. The hegemony had sent them to die with garbage in their hands. And instead, they had invented a new way of fighting that the galaxy had never seen. They called it chaos. And it was beautiful. And it was working. High Counselor Vexus had ruled the galactic hegemony for 300 years. And in all that time, he had never felt fear the way he felt it. Now, he sat in the great council chamber surrounded by the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and they all stared at the holographic display that showed the Battle of Meridian Valley. The footage had been classified at the highest level because no one wanted the general population to see what had happened there, and no one wanted to admit what it meant for the future of the hegemony. Meridian Valley was supposed to be a massacre. And everyone had agreed on that before the battle began. 10,000 human soldiers faced 50,000 Vectory warriors. supported by heavy armor and air superiority. And the mathematics of warfare said that the humans should have been destroyed. Within hours, the hegemony had already written off the sector and had begun planning how to use the human defeat as propaganda to encourage more species to join the war effort, but the humans had not been destroyed, and they had not been defeated, and they had not even been pushed back. The footage showed human soldiers charging across the valley floor in vehicles that looked like they had been assembled from a dozen different wrecks. And those vehicles moved faster than any vectory machine, and they fired weapons that tore through enemy armor like paper. The footage showed human infantry wearing armor made from vectory chitin and carrying rifles that fired beams of energy that the hegemony sensors could not identify. And those soldiers fought with a fury that bordered on madness. The footage showed the vectory lines breaking and retreating in chaos. And it showed 50,000 of the most feared warriors in the galaxy running from 10,000 humans who had been sent to die with garbage. How is this possible? Vexus asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. Admiral Kethro had spent 3 centuries studying warfare, and he had never seen anything like what was on that screen. And he struggled to find words that could explain it. The humans have done something that should not be possible. "High Counselor," he said carefully, "they have taken the obsolete equipment we gave them, and they have transformed it into weapons we do not understand." "Transformed how?" "They have reverse-engineered our technology and combined it with vectory technology and with systems they invented themselves. And they have created hybrid weapons that do not follow any known engineering principles." Counselor Thresh leaned forward with concern on his ancient face. And he had opposed the plan to use humans as cannon fodder from the beginning. "I warned this council that we did not understand humanity," he said. "I told you that their history showed a species capable of incredible adaptation and creativity. And I told you that sending them to war with inferior equipment was a mistake. You told us they would die too quickly to be useful." Another counselor snapped. "You did not tell us they would become this." The footage continued to play, and it showed a human commander leading a charge against a vectory fortification. And the commander was a woman with dark skin and fierce eyes. And she moved with the confidence of someone who knew she could not be stopped. Elena Vance, the report said, promoted from sergeant major to colonel in 6 months because she kept winning battles that should have been impossible to win. She started with 50 soldiers and a pile of broken rifles, Catherall said. Now she commands 10,000 and her forces have not lost a single engagement in 3 months. Vexus watched the footage and he saw something that terrified him more than any weapon or tactic. He saw humans laughing as they fought, and he saw them celebrating each small victory, and he saw them treating the most desperate battle as a game. They were determined to win. These were not soldiers fighting because they had been ordered to fight, and they were not conscripts hoping to survive long enough to go home. These were warriors who had found their purpose, and they were having fun. What did they want? Vexus asked, High Counselor? The humans, what did they want from us? What did we promise them in exchange for their service? Catherall checked his records and frowned. We promised them citizenship and the hegemony if they survived. And we gave them the lowest grade of equipment because we assumed they would not survive. And now they have survived. And now they are winning our war for us. So, what do we do when they come to collect on that promise? The council chamber fell silent as the implications of that question settled over everyone present. Humans had been treated as expendable resources, and they had been given garbage and expected to die. And instead they had become the most effective fighting force the galaxy had ever seen. What would they demand in return for their service? And what would happen if the hegemony refused to give it to them? Councilor Myrith spoke up from the back of the chamber, and she was the youngest member of the council and the most ruthless. We should eliminate them now while we still can, she said coldly. declare them a threat to galactic stability, and order their extermination before they become too powerful to stop. Vexus considered the suggestion for a moment, and part of him agreed that it would be the safest course of action. But then he looked at the footage again, and he saw what the humans had accomplished with garbage and determination. And he imagined what they might accomplish if the hegemony gave them a reason to fight against it instead of for it. No, he said firmly, we will not make enemies of them, not when we have seen what they can do. Then, what do you suggest? Vexus made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. And he knew even as he made it that the hegemony would never be the same. We give them what they want, he said. Full military partnership with equal equipment, full citizenship with all rights and privileges, and a seat on this council. The chamber erupted in protests and objections, and several councilors stood up to voice their outrage at the suggestion. They are primitives, someone shouted. They have been in space for barely a generation, and you want to give them a seat among us? They were primitives, Vexus said, and his voice cut through the noise and silenced the chamber. Now they are winning a war that we were losing, and they are doing it with weapons we cannot understand. And if we do not bring them into our alliance as equals, they will eventually decide to take what they want by force. He pointed at the screen where the footage still played, and he pointed at Elena Vance leading her soldiers to victory. Look at them, he said. Look at what they accomplished with nothing, and imagine what they will accomplish when they have everything. And ask yourself if you want them as allies or as enemies. The council voted, and the decision was close. But in the end, the pragmatists outnumbered the idealists. The galactic hegemony sent a message to Kashari Prime offering humanity full partnership and equality, and they hoped that it would be enough. Lena received the message in her command tent, and she read it carefully. And she smiled. They are afraid of us, she said to Marcus. They should be, he replied. The question is whether we accept their offer or whether we keep fighting until we can take more. Elena thought about it for a long moment, and she thought about all the soldiers who had died on Kashari Prime. And she thought about all the soldiers who would die if the war continued. We accept, she said finally. For now, we accept, and we let them think they have bought our loyalty with promises. And later? Elena looked out at the red dust of Kashari Prime, and she thought about all the species in the galaxy who had treated humanity as inferior and expendable. Later we show them what humans really are. 1 year had passed since the first human soldiers landed on Kashari Prime with broken weapons and outdated armor. And in that year, the galaxy had changed forever. The Vecthory horde had been shattered, and their homeworld had surrendered. And their warriors, who had never known defeat in 1,000 years of conquest, now knelt before the species they had once dismissed as prey. General Elena Vance stood on the bridge of the HSS Defiance and looked out at the stars. And she thought about how far humanity had come in such a short time. The Defiance was the flagship of the human fleet, and it was unlike any ship the galaxy had ever seen. And it was beautiful in a way that made other species uncomfortable. The hull was covered in welds and patches, where different sections had been joined together, and no two parts matched. And the whole thing looked like it had been assembled by someone who did not know that ships were supposed to be symmetrical. But the Defiance was faster than any hegemony cruiser, and it was tougher than any Vectory battleship. And its weapons were a mystery that even the most advanced engineers in the galaxy could not understand. The hegemony had offered humanity their finest vessels after the alliance was signed, and they had presented gleaming ships built to perfect specifications. And they had expected the humans to be grateful. The humans had declined. Why would we want your ships? Elena had asked the hegemony ambassador. Your ships can only do what they were designed to do, but our ships can do anything we need them to do. The ambassador had not understood, and Elena had not tried to explain. because explaining would have revealed the secret that humanity had discovered on Kashari Prime. The secret was that perfection was weakness, and that the most powerful weapon in the galaxy was not the most advanced technology, but the ability to adapt and improvise and overcome. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Cole walked onto the bridge and stood beside Elena. And he had aged in the past year, and there was gray in his hair that had not been there before. But his eyes were still sharp, and his smile was still dangerous. And he was still the same man who had stood beside her in the cargo hold of that transport ship and promised that they would show the galaxy what humans could do. The hegemony. Council has approved our request, he said. They are giving us the Outer Rim territories, all of them. All of them. And they are also giving us authority over defense for the entire sector. And they are funding the expansion of our fleet. Elena laughed. And it was a sound of genuine amusement mixed with something darker. They still think they can control us, she said. They think if they give us enough, they can keep us satisfied and loyal. Can they? Elena thought about the question, and she thought about all the species in the galaxy who had looked down on humanity. And she thought about all the soldiers who had died because the hegemony had considered them expendable. For now, she said. But only for now. The victory celebrations had ended weeks ago. But humanity was still celebrating in its own way on Kashari Prime, which had become a monument to human resilience. Engineers were building the first human academy of innovation. Students from every colony and every nation would come to learn the techniques that had won the war. And they would learn that the most important skill in the galaxy was not knowledge of advanced technology, but the creativity to make something new from something old. Private First Class Daisuke Tanaka had been promoted to chief engineer of the academy, and he spent his days teaching young humans how to build impossible things. His first lesson was always the same, and he would stand in front of a pile of broken equipment and tell his students to build something useful. But sir, this is all garbage, one student had said on the first day. Tanaka had smiled, and he had picked up a burnt-out power cell and a piece of scrap metal. And in 5 minutes, he had built a device that could detect victory life signs from a kilometer away. There is no garbage, he had told them. There is only material you have not learned to use yet on Earth. Humans who had never left their planet watched the broadcasts from Kashari Prime and felt pride in their species. For the first time in generations, children played games where they pretended to be Elena Vance or Marcus Cole or Amara Okonkwo, and they built toy weapons from household items and fought imaginary victory in their backyards. The message of the war had spread across human civilization, and it was a message that resonated with something deep in the human spirit. You are never defeated as long as you keep fighting. And you are never helpless as long as you can think. And you can overcome any obstacle if you refuse to accept that it cannot be overcome. High Counselor Vexus watched the humans with growing unease, and he wondered if he had made the right decision by bringing them into the hegemony as equals. They were spreading through the galaxy faster than any species in history, and they were building colonies on worlds that the hegemony had considered uninhabitable. And they were creating technology that should not exist. They are too successful, Counselor Myrith warned him. They will outgrow us within a generation. Perhaps, Vexus admitted. But what would you have me do about it? Myrith had no answer because there was no answer. Because the humans had become too powerful to stop without starting a war that the hegemony would probably lose. Elena received regular reports on the Council's discussions. Because human intelligence had infiltrated every level of hegemony government within months of the alliance being signed. They are afraid of us, Marcus said as he read the latest report. They should be. Elena replied, but we are not ready to move against them yet. When will we be ready? Elena looked at the stars through the viewport of the Defiance, and she thought about everything humanity had accomplished in just 1 Year they had gone from disposable soldiers to respected partners. And they had gone from fighting with garbage to building the most advanced weapons in the galaxy. And they had proven that they could not be underestimated or ignored, but they had also lost thousands of soldiers in the war. And they had suffered because the hegemony had not valued their lives. And there were debts that still needed to be paid. Soon, she said. When we have enough ships and enough soldiers and enough technology to ensure that no one can ever treat us as expendable again. Marcus nodded, and he understood what she meant. Because he had been with her from the beginning, and he knew that this was never just about survival. This was about proving that humanity belonged among the stars. And this was about ensuring that no species would ever look down on them again. And this was about building a future where humans would not just survive, but thrive. The hegemony had sent them to war with scrap because they expected them to die. And instead they had forged an empire. What do we call ourselves now? Marcus asked. Elena smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who knew that the hunt was far from over. We call ourselves what we have always been, she said. We are human, and we are survivors. And we are the future of this galaxy. The Defiance turned toward the outer rim, and the fleet followed behind it. And humanity continued its march across the stars. They had been given garbage and expected to die. And instead they had become something that the galaxy would remember forever. They had become conquerors, and they had become legends. And they had proven that the most dangerous creature in the universe was a human with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The old empires had ruled for 10,000 years through technology and fear. And now a new power had risen to challenge them, and it had all started with a pile of scrap and a species that refused to accept defeat. The galaxy would never be the same again.